24. Does not say on there verse 36. Hop there. If you would like to go ahead and get ready for where we're going to afterwards, that's going to be Genesis chapter 6. I did make the promise I wanted to preach to everybody here a little bit more out of the New Testament, but we're already into my third teaching of the year, and I've already slipped back up into Genesis. You knew it was going to happen. Do not fault me. But there are some things I do want us to kind of take a look at, just kind of some of the things buzzing around in my mind as of late. I've heard several people kind of joke about with all the rain that we've already received this year. Thank goodness for it, because we really don't want our mud puddles to dehydrate. Maybe that's why Noah's on the brain. I'm not entirely sure. But let's go to Matthew 24, and let's go to verse 36. It says, "But of that day and hour no one knows," and again this is Jesus speaking, "not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only." This verse was one that I found kind of freeing a few years ago whenever I was reading across it one day in my office, because there were some people that we were talking with. We were kind of going back and forth on some ideas, and they were just really adamant that they had to know this whatever it was. I don't even remember quite the subject it was. But what I found so freeing about it was Jesus didn't even always have the answers people were asking him for, only the Father did. And if Jesus doesn't know everything, I'm not going to think I have to have the ego to try to make people think I know everything either. Maybe that's what somebody needed this morning. Let's get back to the lesson off this little segue. "But my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, and giving in marriage until that day that Noah entered the ark." Now, what's wrong with what he just said? Was there really anything wrong with that? They were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. Well, actually, if we were to do one of the very first commandments that God had given us to do, that we find all the way back in Genesis, being fruitful and multiplying, this is kind of how some of that goes. Eating, you get to live to see tomorrow. Drinking, we're going to pretend it's just water. That's a good thing. So there's not a really lot of majorly bad things we see. They were continuing to do the things that would bring them to the next day. We're going to take a look at some things that are mentioned in Scripture a little bit later on that to me stick out, to me that make a difference. But why is it that Jesus is comparing the people here? He's telling the people what's going to happen in the future. It's also going to take place in the past. We're going to take a look at that. Verse 39, "And did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will be the coming of Son of Man be." Now, all of us who are here this morning, we've all pretty much heard passages like this taught and explained and expounded and preached upon. We know that Jesus is going to be coming back someday, Lord willing, be it soon. We know that. Did the people all the way back then know that there was something coming upon them all the way back then? Now, one thing I will say, I have the book, I brought it with me, Ron and I were talking about it this morning, and it's by this man by the name Josephus. He was a first century historian. He was actually a contemporary of many of the apostles. I want to say that his quote-unquote official living record was from year 37 A.D. to the year 100. And a lot of, if you go into the church history, he's quoted quite a bit. He made a lot of comments and distinguishments about Pharisees. He also made them about Sadducees. If you've ever heard of the Dead Sea Scroll community, he's also one of the ones people use that talk about the Dead Sea Scroll community known as the Essenes, or Essens, as Bradford likes to put it so favorably. And one of the legends that he recorded that was according to, at least in his time, was that all the way back when, talking about even the time of Noah, the people had this awareness that God was actually going to send a flood upon this world and upon the planet, and that also he was going to send fire upon the world as well. And the reason I mentioned that, it's an historical record. It said that the people created the stone and carved into the stone some information they wanted to survive both water and fire. And I'm not necessarily giving credence to what this guy says, but it does make me think of the verse from Numbers I quote quite a bit that I talked to Ron again this morning about. I mentioned last time I preached was the fact that if there was something that was going to be used in the service and dedication of God, it had to be purified by water and or fire if possible. I do think it interesting that whenever we all know the account of Noah, what happened? The world became so corrupt in the flesh that guess what? God had to reboot it, and what did the world have to be washed with? Water. Well, Revelation seems like there's another side of the coin because we have the rainbow. Why? It's a promise that he'll never again flood the earth. Well, if there's any other way that we can purify something, I wonder what's coming that Revelation might talk about. So I do think it's kind of an interesting tie-in and tidbit. But one thing I will say is that if you actually go back and you take a look at the genealogies of the individuals who were alive up until the time of Noah, and you take a look at what each separate name means, we already have an indication that there's going to be a flood coming. So perhaps that is a viable theory, I don't know. But we know whenever Jesus is talking about in the future and the coming of the Son of Man, we already have that warning. I do think that it's possible that all the people back in Noah's day, 2 Peter says that he was a preacher of righteousness. Maybe the people already knew, but did the people really care? Who knows? Moving on, verse 40. Let's go back to 39. And did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will be the coming of Son of Man be. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour it is that the Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. And we're going to go ahead and just close out the chapter. I think this is kind of fitting. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made rule over his household, to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Assuredly, I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day that he is not looking for him, and an hour he is not aware of, and will cut him in two, and appoint his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. One of the things that I heard some years ago that I've always thought of ever since, it's just kind of stuck with me. It said, a lot of the times we feel like waiting is wasting. A lot of the times we don't like waiting on certain things to take place or to happen. And one of the things I've kind of tried to incorporate, at least into my own personal being, is the fact that if I know I'm going to be waiting, make use of the time. If I know something's going to take place half an hour from now, I think of half an hour's worth of activities I can go ahead and get the ball rolling to help progress A, B, C, whatever it's going to be. So that way I've kept busy. I've made use. There's been a couple of trips that my wife's taken. I know a year or two back she went to one of her cousin's weddings. One summer we had one. The next year we had the other cousin. And I wasn't able to go to one of them due to my work schedule. But whenever she came back home, I knew she was going to be home close to dark one of the evenings. And so I just went ahead and done everything in the house. I had taken care of all the dishes that I had done. I'd went ahead and cleaned up the house, cleaned up different rooms. And it wasn't because she was demanding that they be done by the time they got back. But I didn't think that she would be unappreciative of me taking care of some things. Why? I really doubt after being gone for a week or half a week, however long it was, that she would want to come home to something needing to be taken care of. Because a lot of people think waiting is wasting. But waiting is actually something God commands us to do. And one of the things that I've heard again that I like is, what do waiters do? You know, if you go to a restaurant, what do waiters do? They serve. And that's something we have to incorporate within ourselves, is learning how to serve one another. But with that being said, I just really like this where it was talking about the servants. They were waiting, and they knew what their job title and their description was. So what did they do? They went ahead and served. Now let's go ahead and go over to Genesis 6. And I want us to kind of look at Noah and his life. I mean, I know there's 2 or 3 occasions in the past few years I've spoken about Noah. But I want us to kind of take a glimpse into some of the key things. And I do want us to start at verse 1, just kind of as a backdrop to kind of contrast the colors a little bit about who Noah was and what everybody else was. It says, "Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said," in verse 3, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of his thoughts, of his heart, was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them." In verse 8, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." And again, going back to the verse that I keep mentioning all the time in the book of Numbers, you have water, you have fire. And there was a baptism that I was privileged to take part of and help do a few years ago. And one of the things I brought up before we did the baptism was that if you actually take a look in the ancient records, they consider the first, what we would call and consider baptism, the immersion. This is where it all started. This is where the picture is. And I like verse 8, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." Ron and I were talking this morning about how in the very first verse of the Bible in Hebrew, it's only 7 words long. In English, most of the translations have a bare minimum of 10 words. What's my whole conclusion to that? It takes longer in English to get the point across than it does Hebrew. Noah in English, 4 letters long. If you look in the Hebrew, it's only 2 letters long. And if you take Noah's name and you just spell the 2 letters, just invert them, flip them backwards, you actually have the word grace in Hebrew. Interesting little tidbit to me. 2 of you found that interesting. Let's move on. Verse 9. This is the genealogy of Noah. So if I were to talk about the genealogy of Jeremiah Darden, what would it say? Well, for Noah, it says, "Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations." Well, if I was going to talk about my genealogies, I might talk about Larry, I might talk about Gavin. Very first thing mentioned in his genealogy is that he was a just and perfect man. Now, bear in mind when it says that he was perfect, that doesn't mean he had this bright shining halo above his head that shimmered in such a way that all whom gazed upon it hurt and lowered their eyes. It just meant that he found completion. He found himself being complete in God. Noah walked with God. He was a just man, perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. I actually wore my company shirt this morning. This is my uniform. Many of you know me as JJ. This actually is my real name, Jeremiah, so that's a shock to some of you, and I work for Sylvia. There's some people, men and women, that I work with 36, 48, 60 hours a week. Thank God I haven't done 72 or 84 yet. I'm trembling when those days are coming, but that may happen later. But no matter how many hours a day or days in a week or all the months that I've worked with them so far, a lot of us have the same goal. We have the same end means. We all want to keep our machines running. We do not want to have to shut them down. We had open house the other day. A lot of people understood that looks like a lot of work. It is. That's if it's running smoothly. And there's times to where if I have to go into the back with one of my machines to make sure all 5 of our extruder machines are full and have all the materials and stuff that they need, if I'm already back there for line 3, which is what I'm helping parent, anyways, I'm not going to talk about work much longer. But if I'm already back there for my line, I already have to walk by the materials for line 2 and line 1. If it takes just a minute's worth of time, why not stop and make sure everybody's got the materials? I can shovel them into place. That way they go through our transport system. In other words, treat them how you want to be treated. Have that thing to where you have enough, not just self-integrity to make sure that you're taken care of, but be somebody who is willing to be able to help others, even if it costs you just a fraction of a second. No big deal. But it doesn't matter if I work with the people 36, 48, 60 hours a week. We all have the same one goal at the end. But whenever we punch out our clock, type in our information to leave, we're not walking together. We might walk together on the floor, but once it's our own personal time, I have never seen any 2 people really walk together. That's because our business together is done. When it says here that Noah walked with God, that was a personal thing in his life. When it said that he was a perfect man, just and complete, or just and perfect, it means that he found completion in God. It wasn't just a job. It wasn't just a paycheck. It wasn't, sure, I'll preach X amount of Sundays or Wednesdays or go to different congregations for paychecks. No, it's a living reality to what his life was. And something I want us to think about too, those who know the story so well, why was it that these 8 individuals were spared? It was because of their righteousness, yes? Mixed answers. I love mixed answers. It was because of Noah. It was because of his righteousness, his completion. And I want us to think about that realm of influence that we have. Not just little bitty me or bigger plus-sized me. I want us to think about how do our cups overflow into the lives of other people. It was like you speaking this morning. There's somebody that's confiding into you a lot of the personal details in their life. You can be a just and complete individual knowing that you need that grace from God to know how to initiate, how to respond. And that's something that is true inside each and every one of us. You know, I've mentioned before that with the youth group that I came from, there were a lot of individuals. There was at one point, we had more people showing up in the youth and teenagers on Wednesday nights than we had the whole church on Sunday mornings. That was pretty incredible, you know, for us. And I just remembered some of the individuals that I was privileged enough to be used by God just to help brush and bump elbows with, bump shoulders with, to be able to see God work in their lives as well, because it was so rewarding. And it was all because I realized how incomplete I was without God. You know, I've mentioned before my testimony. First 13 years of my life, the only time I stepped foot inside a church, 2 times. One, I had a friend bring me to a quick Sunday school thing, which was more like free child care. And then the other one was my sister renewing her vows X amount of years after she and my brother-in-law had gotten married. That was it. But I'm thankful that that's how my life began. As weird as that probably sounds, you hear somebody preaching on a Sunday morning to say. And the reason I say that is because I got to experience what a home without God was like, and that made me crave the normalcy of what grace can bring. And Noah begot 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth was also corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and outside with pitch. That's one of the things I wanted to start off reading Matthew 24, is because servants, they've got something they've got to do. And it says here that whenever Noah was told to go ahead and initiate this whole sequence that probably took a minimum of 100 years, what did he have to do? He had to serve. And what did he have to do with this vessel? He had to work to do modifications on not just the outside, but there was some internal prep work that he had to do if this was actually going to work. There's a lot of the things that just from what life that we have, there's some things that are going to be evident that we've got to work on to the lives of others, as far as it's evident to them that we need to clean up some things on the outside. But most importantly, there's some things that we've got to work in here as well. I know Jesus, whenever he was talking to some of the religious leaders, he called them a bunch of whitewashed tombs. Remember, if you actually stepped on a grave or stepped near one, you could be rendered unclean and have to go through the purification process again. What a lot of the things that they would do is they would whitewash a lot of these tombs, so that way, no matter, even if it was super dark, if there was any bit of light from the moon or from a torch, you would know it was a grave. You would not step on that and contaminate, so to speak, or have that defilement. He said, you're whitewashed. You look white and pristine on the outside, but on the inside you're full of death. Again, even with Noah, not only was it something he had to work on the outside, one of the major things that he had to do was some internal work. Same for you and I. Verse 15, and this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50, and the height 30. And you shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in the side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. And behold, I myself am bringing flood waters to the earth to destroy from under heaven all the flesh in which there is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And every living thing of all flesh shall bring two of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. Jumping down to verse 22. And Noah did according to all that God had commanded him, so he did. And again, going back to 2 Peter, and I believe it's the 3rd chapter, where it talks about how Noah was this man who was a preacher of righteousness. Now, if Noah was answerable to a board like many pastors are today, what kind of grade do you think that they would give him based on the numbers he produced? How many people total were spared? Noah. There was Noah's wife and his 3 sons and their wives. That's 8 people. Don, do you think a lot of deacons and church boards would be happy with just 8 individuals? Well, they're outside the ark, so who cares, right? People would say that probably doesn't look so good. That he probably could have done better. One thing about it, a lot of the times if we judge success on the immediate results, we're going to lose a lot of wind in our sails because we're short-terming what God is doing now. Long-term, narrative be true, all of us are here today. Guess what? Long-term, that worked out pretty well, at least on our end. I'm glad we're on this side of the coin and not on the other. But I want us to take a look at also a little bit more on the profile of Noah. He said that he found completion in God. He was perfect in all of his ways because he went to God to find this completion. Even if it was just 8 individuals, his realm of influence was so strong that at least it spared 7 other people. I know if you actually take a look and you do a word search for the name Noah into the rest of the scriptures, he pops up a couple of times in the book of Isaiah. And it talks about how, in this prophecy or whatever's going on, about how corrupt things are going to be and how it's going to take place. And he even said that if Noah, Job, and Daniel were in the city or in this place that they're talking about, 3 of the most elite individuals that we find in our Hebrew scriptures, only those 3 would survive. Think about it. Noah actually had such swing or such pull with God. He was actually, able to help save his family. But there would come a time that whenever only these 3 people, if they were in the city, they would be the only 3 spared. And I know people kind of take a little bit of a knock because they say the first thing he did whenever he got off the ark was that he went and got sloshed on some heavy grape juice and got drunk. Please, people, seriously? I really doubt that whenever he landed on top of a vineyard. There would have been some time that would have passed. And even if, and again, I'm not saying that I'm saying everybody needs to go buy some used to be water Jesus turned to heavy wine kind of stuff. Noah lived in 3 worlds. Noah got to experience 3 worlds. He got to see what the world was like whenever it was full of chaos. And think about how ruthless this world is today, as far as not just in the United States, but I mean all around the world. I mean, we see and know the videos of believers who are getting their heads chopped off or that they're becoming dismembered. I know there's like 2,000 or 3,000 Christians a day who are killed for the simple fact that they call themselves Christians. Ron and I were talking this morning about some of the people in history in the past couple thousand years, some of the vicious and vile and brutal things that they would do for pleasure to other people. Think about how wicked we've seen this world. And you know what? It's not bad enough God sent the fire yet. If that be true, think about how bad they would have been prior to the waters. Noah got to live in that world. And if he was a preacher of righteousness, if he was a man who walked with God, going back to the illustration I used about how I might work with my coworkers, but you've never seen us walk together in the life outside of the building walls. If Noah was a man enough who found completion in God that he walked with God, he would have cared about the same things God would have cared about. If you are in a very personal relationship with somebody else, even if it's not something that you've seen or that you yourself have witnessed, but if something breaks their heart, it's going to stir something inside of you and it's going to break your heart just a little bit. And if God was forced where he had to send the waters on this world to basically reboot to have a 2.0, that might be something that bothered Noah quite a bit as well. He got to see how ruthless this world was before, and him being a preacher of righteousness, maybe those 8 he wasn't content with. So the first world he got to see was how wicked it was. He got to see the world of judgment come down, and not only from the waters falling from the heavens, it actually says that this land broke up. Hey, buddy, what are you doing? It's my son. He's mine. He's adorable. Ignore that. But it says that it came down in such tumultuation that even the waters came up from the grounds as well. He got to see a lot of this stuff kind of happen and take place. Maybe he was up in the window watching it. I don't think I would have been able to. But then he got to see the third world, the world that God was going to help restart and bring back, and he got to be a couple of the pieces of the cog to help rebuild what the world was going to become. That's a lot of pressure that man had carried. And again, if you take a look at immediate results, a lot of people would probably slam Noah with an F because he only saved 8 people. But if you take a look into the long-term effects that his obedience had, what would the world think about how the world would be different if he wasn't obedient? We're all sitting in this church today reading about some of the after effects of his life. That's how long-lasting his obedience reached into the future. Me, I have to flip it back onto myself a little bit. There's a lot of the things right now that I don't really see any of the results whatsoever. But if I'm being obedient to God and leave it in God's hands, that's going to be his business, not so much mine. I just have to be continuing to be faithful. Something I have to think about whenever I purposely stray off, whenever I purposely don't hit the arrow, I sin. I have to also consider how long-reaching and how long-lasting the effects that my sin is going to take as well. Not to try to end on a downer, but I do have to think of these things just a little bit. And I realize that there's a lot of small pieces that this story has. Again, him taking the ark and him having to do inside and outside, that's prep work. There's things I have to polish on the outside and grind down to where I have to make a little bit more smooth. I remember whenever I first started preaching here back in 2008, right about the time I started preaching, I went over to my sister Trish's house. And for those of you who know Trish, the very first Bible I ever owned came from her. I've talked about the story about how my family was just fragmenting and splintering. And Mom was here, Dad was there, just a whole bunch of not so great things going on. And on my 10th birthday, I celebrated that birthday in a one-parent home. That's not to knock anybody. That's just family history. I'm allowing you to see that glimpse into my life because I have promised you I will have that transparency if that means to show where God is in my life. And my sister Trish actually gave me a Bible. It was a Youth Walk devotional Bible geared specifically towards teenagers, and she wrote in the front cover of it basically explaining a short bit of a testimony on what she hoped this Bible would do for me in my life. And it meant the world to me. Whenever I first started going to church 3 years later, I brought that very same Bible to church with me. And when they asked me to turn to John 3:16, I thank God that my best friend's name was John. I handed him the Bible, and he turned there for me because I didn't know how to navigate the Bible whatsoever. Just being able to have that, just being the witness for that, you know. I remember just something small, something profound, and $15, $20 Bible landing into my hands. I appreciated the gift. I didn't know how to maneuver. I didn't know how to jump back and forth in the pages of the scripture, but she went through and she underlined 4 verses in that Bible for me. And I remember sitting alone in my room quite often, just flipping, trying to find wherever those 4 pieces were, those 4 verses. And I began to ponder right then and there what God had purposed for my life. Where was he in my life? Could I find him? It was no coincidence that 3 years later, the first time I got to sit in a Sunday morning service, I accepted Christ into my life to be my own personal Savior because somebody was willing to spend a little bit of money, not just to give me a King James Bible and not do anything in it and just throw it in my face. Not that that's a bad thing whatsoever. But they knew the investment necessary on how to move forward and enact in somebody's life. And sometimes it's not about preaching these grand, illustrious, just speeches that are full of eloquence and all these other things that really impress people. That shine fades away. And I really hope that nobody thinks I'd make little of having the opportunity to speak. I love being able to do this. I love being able to just share with you these little insights, these little facts, and these things that I find. I really do. But it's being obedient in the small things, because it's the small things that God will use to literally move the mountains, to be able to put you into this ark, into a place of rest, into a place of safety. And just highlighting a couple of notes I've used in the times past. The word here, when it talks about the ark in Hebrew, is teva. And, you know, we have the words for boats, we have the words for ships. The word in the Hebrew here for ark, whenever you translate, it's just teva. It just means box, oddly enough. And the only other time that this word teva is ever used in the Hebrew scriptures again is Moses' basket. Why? They both preserved life. They both contained within it life. And something I think is pretty interesting and kind of neat as well. Aramaic and Hebrew are not the same things, but Aramaic was a very common tongue in the first century. I want to say if you watch The Passion of the Christ, that's kind of what they're speaking as some sort of Aramaic. They also have in their lingo and in their glossary the term teva. Now, it doesn't mean box, but what teva does mean in Aramaic is the word word. And I think it's kind of neat that in the first century climate that if we talk about the ark, talking about being found inside the teva, and that's what preserved life. If you talk about whenever Moses was a little baby, guess what? Moses was in the teva, it preserved his life. If you go to Aramaic, which was pretty much the Koine common speak in a lot of the first century in the Judean area, guess what? Who was the Word? Jesus is the Word. And there's a lot of judgment that's going to be coming down. There's going to be judgment for the good things. There's going to be judgment for the bad things. And I pray that the place we find ourselves to be is inside that teva, to be inside the ark, to be inside the Word, because it's necessary. That's where it's for us to be. And the final little tidbit I want to throw out there, and I think Ron will like this. Don, you know it as well. If you take the dimensions of the ark, it talks about it's got to be 300 one way and 50 the other way and 30 the other. I've said time and time again, Hebrew is a fascinating language. If you have the opportunity to learn a little bit of it, I do highly encourage it. There's a lot of really fun things there. For us, we have A, B, C all the way to X, Y, Z. And if we want to have numbers, well, we've got a few of them there on the board. When you look at the numbers, there's not a one of them that's a letter from the alphabet. For Hebrew, they use their alphabet as both letters and a numeric system. If you take the number that's for 300, the number for 50, and the number for 30, you could actually arrange it to where it's 30, 300, and then 50. And it's the word in Hebrew, if you take the numbers and translate them into the letters, it's the word lashon. Now, as a noun, lashon is tongue. But as a verb, as something you do, it's your speech. Think about that. One of the things that I wanted to mention that is we have the fire in Revelation, we have the water in Genesis. You know what else we also have mentioned in the book of Revelation? They overcome him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they love not their lives to the end. That picture, just the numbers, the dimensions of the ark, one of the things we could find there is confession. We can also find our speech, our tongue, the things that we say. And if Noah was a preacher of righteousness, there were things that he would have told his family, perhaps individuals outside of the family. And it's not always up to us how people are going to respond, but it's up to us how we carry ourselves and present ourselves. Again, going back to the much-needed external and internal work both. And these are just some of the insights that we kind of gleaned through, going through the life of Noah, and also comparing them with the words of Jesus. There's just so much here, even just in the life of Noah, that for me, these are the high spots that we can kind of bring up. And that's really it for my portion this morning. Father,